All right, it's noon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tanner Curl. I'm the Executive Director of MinnPost. We're a nonprofit independent newsroom serving Minnesota. And this is our latest installment of MinnPost Social, where we bring together reporters and editors to talk about what's going on in the news. Today, that'll be Peter Callaghan and Walker Orenstein, as well as our editor, Andy Putz, talking about the legislative session that just wrapped up and will continue on soon enough. They'll get into that. But first, I want to give a few plugs. One, I know a number of you are very loyal MinnPost readers, for which we are grateful. If you aren't signed up for any of our newsletters, we have a daily newsletter, we have a Sunday review newsletter, we have a Greater Minnesota newsletter that comes out on Tuesdays, we have a DC memo that comes out every Thursday from our Washington correspondent, Ashley Hackett. We have our daily coronavirus update. They are all free, and they'll bring MinnPost news right to your inbox. You can sign up for those at minnpost.com/newsletters. Like I said, they're free, as well as all of our original reporting is available to all readers for free, thanks to member support. So I first want to thank all of the members who are here, and also give a plug. You can support our work, support these reporters and editors and what they do with a donation of any amount. You can go to minnpost.com/support. Any amount makes a difference. minnpost.com/support. And I want to thank our sponsors for this series, Great River Energy, who not only sponsor MinnPost Socials, they sponsor MinnPost overall, so we're grateful for their support. I also want to thank Darla Cashin at RBC Wealth Management for supporting this series. And Darla, I believe you're here and you wanted to say a few words, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know what's on your mind.
It seems like this far into the process, I should know how to do that. So that's the good news. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for attending today. And, you know, one of the things during COVID, if we look at some of the positives, is that, you know, these were limited attendance events when we were live and in person. And while I look forward to that, I also appreciate that we're able to include a lot more people by doing this remotely. So if you're not a member, become a member, because when we go back to being live, you're going to need to do that in order to get first dibs at attending live events. But also my constant reminder that a free press isn't free. So more than ever, we need good local coverage. And many states are not as fortunate as we are to have people at the Capitol covering what's going on in local politics. So I know I love it, and it's part of why I do what I do for MinnPost, and I hope you're all members and doing the same. Thanks and enjoy.
Great. Thanks, Darla. Before I hand it over to Andy Putz, I want to give everybody a heads up. So Walker and Peter and Andy are going to be talking for a little bit, but we are going to be taking your questions. You'll have two options with that. You can either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, and you can ask your question directly, or you can go ahead and throw it in the chat. So be thinking of questions as they're talking. The only request we have is that these are actual questions and not ongoing commentaries. You can save those for the comment section of minnpost.com. But as you come up with questions, again, you can either raise your hand or put them in the chat at any time, and we'll have you in the queue when we get to that part. But with that, I'll hand it over to editor Andy Putz.
Thanks, Tanner. Yeah, my name is Andy Putz. I'm the editor of MinnPost. So thank you all for doing this. It's a little different, changing up, doing a noontime MinnPost Social. And let's just get right to it. I'm going to ask a few questions of Peter and Walker. But again, feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. And then we'll also open it up for people to actually ask their own questions. That didn't work as well the last time. People were very shy about doing that, but I have looked at a lot of the people on this call, and I know many of you are not shy. So we are expecting to be a different situation this time out. So let's just get right to it. Peter, let's start with you. You know, give us an overview of sort of where we are, how we came out of this session, and especially focusing, I guess, because you and Walker both did a big story on this. You know, the broad budget agreement. What does it do, and what does it not do?
Unmute. Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you in an echoey press conference room at the Capitol. You can see the lovely Capitol blueprint behind me. I noticed when I came in that there's a stack of press releases on a credenza off to the side. And that is from the last press conference that was in this room. Health officials announced new community level strategies to slow COVID-19 in Minnesota. This was dated March 13th, 2020. We've not been in this room in anger for that much time. Since I'm in the press conference room, Andy, that means I don't have to answer the questions you've asked me directly. I just get to say whatever I wanted to say anyway. So this was, sort of the weird session that we expected it was going to be because of COVID, because of the fight over emergency powers, because of the start of the session coming right after the insurrection at the US Capitol and the argument over voting and voting rights. So we knew it was just going to be kind of weird, but the Speaker of the House was very prescient at the start of session. She said, essentially look back to 2019. She says, this is the same movie. It's a sequel, but it's probably going to end the same way. And on Monday of this week, at least through this period, it has ended the same way. A lot of sort of world wrestling entertainment, acting out parts by the R's and the D's, raising issues, being outraged, but they ended up in the exact same place. Right at the deadline, the governor, the majority leader, and the speaker came out with their what they call global targets. Only in Minnesota would you call something that happened in St. Paul as being global. But these are the sort of high level numbers and some of the parameters of what a deal will end up being. Now we have a dozen omnibus bills with hundreds of pages each that will start with these targets, but then spend the money beneath that target and add in all sorts of policy bills that have come through the various committees. So right now the schedule is May 28. The speaker and the majority leader want spreadsheets, which is capital talk for the numbers. And then on June 4, they want bill language, which it would be the policy that would be underneath. They're not going to hit those deadlines, but they'll be close. And then theoretically draft bills, print bills, distribute bills, schedule a session somewhere in the area of June 12, 13, 14 to adopt them. And it is kind of where you thought it would be. We think that the total spend will be $52 billion over 2 years. The governor's budget was 52.3. The House was 52.5 and the Senate was 51 plus or so. So it's in the range of that. And again, as the speaker says, she thanks Uncle Joe for making this budget possible. Because to use a technical term, the state got gobs of money from the federal government, both in the December bill, the $900 trillion, no, 1.9, $900 trillion in December. And
Billion
then
in December.
No.
Trillion, because 1.9 trillion was ARP,
Okay,
right?
Thank you. 900 billion in December and the 1.9 trillion in March for the American Rescue Plan. And the state got around 3 or 4 billion from the December bill, and we think they're going to get about 9 billion from the American Rescue Plan. So you throw that much money into the middle of negotiations at the end, and it's pretty easy to come up with a deal that is no new taxes, the tax reductions that really everybody wanted on PPP loan forgiveness, and the $600 top off on unemployment insurance, no tax increases, so tax the rich went away, and almost all of the spending that Walz and the DFL wanted in education, social programs, small business areas, equity spending. So everybody got what they wanted thanks to this federal money.
Great, thank you. Walker, we're gonna turn to you for a second, just because I know you followed a couple of really high profile issues, particularly public safety, the clean cars stuff. Where did that kind of end up, and what's happening with those issues?
Yeah, so coming into the legislative session, or I guess, part of the way through the legislative session, police killed Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, and that really galvanized Democrats to push for more police accountability legislation. They passed last year a whole slate of things, changing deadly force statutes for police, among other things, restricting warrior training, stuff like that. But this year, Democrats came back and now they're saying, we really think it's crucial for us to get more on this issue. Republicans have been hesitant, but as part of sort of the global agreement, as they call it, Speaker Hortman called it just numbers only. And so it's like there's no policy really to hash out yet. And the leaders claim they're leaving that up to sort of key committee chairs here going forward. But Speaker Hortman did say sort of she anticipates there being at least some sort of police accountability measures in the final budget agreement. And Senate Majority Leader Gazelka said, we think there are some things that we can sort of agree on. It's not exactly clear what they'll be yet. Gazelka said, there are some things he was opposed to, qualified immunity, ending that, and some civilian oversight powers. But it seems like there is sort of momentum for limiting things like traffic stops for vehicle offenses like expired tabs and air fresheners, no-knock warrant, no-knock warrant restrictions, things like that. Someone says in the chat,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
No policy yet. So there are proposals on police reform. There was no agreement on any policies that will move forward in both House and the Senate and be approved by the legislature yet, out of the global sort of agreement. There has lots of policy proposed. Democrats, specifically from the Posse Caucus, do have a list of things that they want. And a couple of them, let's see, a couple other ones, like, for instance, there's a measure for making it a police body cam footage available to the family of a loved one who was killed by police, things like that. And so we're basically in waiting mode to see where that goes. The other issue here sort of at stake for the Republicans is they've said that they want to hold up the environmental budget. So that includes things like parks, MPCA, DNR spending, environmental budgets. If the governor doesn't delay his new auto emissions rules, which he's pursuing unilaterally, we would sort of adopt standards for tailpipe emissions and electric vehicles that California has right now. And that's still kind of in limbo as well. That was not resolved by the budget agreement. And so I know in the budget agreement, for instance, the leaders wrote, this doesn't mean that any one seemed like a reference, particularly to the environmental budget, which Senator Bill Ingebrigtsen in that committee has held up. I will say Gazelka seems to have somewhat appeared to distance himself from this at times. He described the issue the other day. He said there's a number of issues that people are passionate about on both sides. And he said, they do support delaying clean car standards, but kind of laying that out as one of many things that Republicans may want. It doesn't seem like he's as ready to fight for that to the extent that Senator Ingebrigtsen is. But if Ingebrigtsen really has the power in that issue, that'll continue to remain a sticking point. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I think it's quite the escalation to threaten parks funding and stuff like that, potentially shutting down parks ahead of July 4th. But Republicans have been really fired up about this issue, and a lot of organizations with ties to Greater Minnesota, where a lot of these lawmakers are from, really oppose these standards. A whole host of agricultural organizations, in particular biofuels groups, things like that. So Those two things are kind of outstanding at this point, as our most major policy decisions are still not resolved.
Walker, I don't know if you saw, there was a question kind of early on in the chat about if Republicans, because you just bringing this up because you just were speaking to the clean cars rule. If Republicans actually did defund state parks on their environmental efforts, would it hurt them at the polls? You're not in the business of making predictions, but I think you did some reporting on this issue.
Yeah, I guess I can't say whether it would hurt them at the polls. That's something we don't really know yet, but I do know parks are very, very popular, and so take that for what you will. I think it'll be interesting to see how it really moves forward. And like I had mentioned, it seemed as if Gazelka kind of distanced himself from that. I know the other day he also explicitly sort of said, you know, he didn't want to shut down parks. I mean, and he said we want to open up Minnesota. We don't want to close it down. And that, you know, of course, nobody wants to shut down parks. He might say that and still think that they should move forward on you know, holding up the environmental budget. But the scuttlebutt around the Capitol is that it's an interesting tactic in that people sort of assume it wouldn't be particularly popular to close down parks. But I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Andy, can I come in on that?
Yeah.
It's not going to hurt them at the polls because it's not going to happen. They will come up with that omnibus bill. If Ingebrigtsen was still pushing for that and the House was opposing that, they would go into the big three in the closed door room. Last time it was in the cabinet room. They would present their disagreement, and Senator Gazelka, Speaker Hortman, and the governor would rule on it. So Gazelka is not going to push a situation where that entire omnibus bill is not agreed to and there is no funding for those areas. I just don't think that's going to happen. And there were some questions in the chat about policy. When the speaker said there's no policy, she means there's no policy in the agreement that they reached, that will come. And there is no policy decisions until they're in a bill, until they're end up written in an omnibus bill. And there's a lot of things along those lines that just aren't decided yet. There's some, just on a smaller issue, there's some additions and reforms in the hate crimes area that is going to either end up or not end up in the judiciary omnibus bill. And it'll be 8 paragraphs of a 100-page bill. And that's where policy will either live or die or pass or not pass based on where those omnibus bills are. And there was a lot of criticism of the governor and the speaker and the majority leader 2 years ago that they were this powerful ruling panel that was thumbing up and thumbing down on every policy issue. And they're kind of sensitive about that this year. And they're saying that they think that will be a rarity, that there's some disagreement from the committee chairs and the conference committees that they have to help resolve. And most of the time they'll say, well, we're not going to do that then. If we can't agree, we're not going to do that then. But the speaker on Monday said, for instance, again, speaking of this 3-person group, we don't want to solve the problem of people with bad personalities. So if they have a committee chair or 2 committee chairs who are fighting and can't agree, she meant to say that they're not going to resolve sort of bickering among committee chairs, and that the result will probably be that that particular issue just gets set aside and is not resolved.
Peter, I want to kind of just talk a little bit more about something you kind of just to expand on that. I mean, you've written about, right, they obviously they hit one deadline, kind of, right, the constitutional deadline to adjourn on Monday, but really the big deadline is July 1 or midnight on June 30 to come up with a 2-year budget. What is, I guess, the feeling at the Capitol about, I mean, they do have some pretty significant policy differences around a lot of this stuff. You know, to what degree are people concerned that they're not going to be able to come to an agreement in a month?
Hardly any concern.
6 weeks. Yeah.
Hardly any concern, I think. Once you have your targets, then the financing parts of the decisions are easy, especially when the targets are pretty generous. If the targets were, $1 billion or $2 billion less than what they are, then there'd be some hard decisions being made in those conference committees. But this is these are budget targets in which everybody gets pretty much what they want. And then underneath that, the lack of agreement just means that particular issue isn't resolved this session. This is a divided legislature, and there are lots of issues that will not be decided by this legislature. It does set us up for needing to pour through those bills to figure out what's in them and what's not in them, and which something we have all of, usually 8 hours or something to do before they're passed. But I think that's unlikely that there something like that happens. The one exception is the bonding bill, because it takes a 60% majority vote to pass, and that gives the 2 minority caucuses their only power over a 2-year period, and they use it. 2 years ago, there wasn't a bonding bill because that last night of session, the Republicans in the House were just saying we're not offering the votes to pass a bonding bill. I think all the other omnibus bills will get resolved and will pass before June 30th, probably well before June 30th.
Maybe saw we got a question in the chat, which I think is a good one, about the public access to the ongoing sort of conference committee work. What is that going to be and look like now?
Well, we were told that the contractor has been hired to take the chain link fence down starting June 1. So it will be gone by the time a special session begins. Again, we think somewhere in the mid-June range. The governor will have to call them back by June 14 because he will extend the emergency authority, and state law requires that the legislature have an opportunity to opine on that. So they're syncing those two things up. But the Capitol wasn't closed because of the fence. The fence was put up after George Floyd was killed, and they wanted to secure the Capitol from civil unrest and other threats against the Capitol. But the building itself has been closed since March, mid-March, and there were crowd size restrictions. The room I'm in right now has a maximum occupancy posted of 8, and this is the press conference room. So that is unlikely that that's going to be staying in. So they will open, we think they'll open the building up completely.
We had a question earlier, I think I missed it, just about, and it kind of spoke a little bit to the access, but how do you think, the lack of having people there, of having activists there, of having people sort of, all the stuff you see when you go to the Capitol about rallies and all that. To what degree do you think how did that affect the legislature, the session this year?
Walker, you want to play with that first?
Yeah, I can touch on it real quickly. I'll just give a real example. I wrote a story today about a bill that updates Minnesota's conservation improvement program. It requires electric and gas utilities to sort of cut their energy use by, for instance, they'll give you a rebate to install a more efficient, heating system or something like that. And I know that's been sort of long in the works, and I talked to the 2 main lawmakers who sort of negotiated that, and they were like, the last couple of weeks were quite difficult for them to sort of figure out the final deal. Not everybody could actually get into the room who was interested in talking about it. They were on the phone a lot, on the Zoom a lot. It was just kind of a mess, which is a little bit interesting. I think that it got to a point where they felt comfortable about it anyway, but it is interesting when they're trying to negotiate complex things sort of at the end of a session, in terms of not having lobbyists and other groups around. In terms of the Capitol, it's a lot quieter over there. I don't know if Peter could speak to that. There have been some rallies outside, sort of on the steps and such, more so lately. I think Scott Jensen had a rally the other day, for instance. But yeah, I don't know, Peter could touch more on sort of the citizen access.
Right, there's absolutely zero citizen access, and you can't be on the steps because the fence is outside the steps, And
On the lawn, maybe. I
yeah,
would say.
Jensen did have a political rally, and we were inside and didn't know it was happening. Now, it was relatively small, but there was 100 or more people there, and you can't hear it. So I'm just not sure how influential that might be. I'm not sure how influential rallies ever are. But there, I guess there's one thing that was positive in that they did this ridiculous thing in 2019 where they would go into bargaining, and then they would come out and they would come over to TV cameras and they would do a Chamberlain-esque, we have our offer right here that we presented to the Democrats to solve this budget. And they said they would give us an answer in 4 hours. And then the Ds would come out and say, they only said we have to stick 6-inch needles into our ears instead of 12-inch needles. That's no compromise. And they would do this back and forth for like the full week. And it was absolutely ridiculous. It accomplished nothing. But I think they did it because we were all standing around and they figured, well, don't want to let a TV camera go to waste. Let's go over there and chat at it. The speaker this past week said, actually the majority leader said, the advantage this year is we're talking to each other, we're not talking over each other. And I think that was a reference to that sort of dog and pony show. And the speaker said, I think we get a lot more done when the two gentlemen I deal with step away from the cameras. The two gentlemen she deals with are Gazelka and Walz. So I do think that made a big difference. They just did not play to cameras at all. And they put this deal together the same way they did last time. I mean, they ended up in the same place, but they still had to come out and do these kind of ridiculous hallway press conferences. So in that regard, COVID helped.
I'm assuming your reference there was also to Neville Chamberlain and not Senator Roger Chamberlain.
There's a difference?
Yeah, right.
All right.
One of the questions, Walker, I wanted to get back to you just about, the other one is I wanted to go back to, someone had a question before about tracking omnibus and conference committee stuff. And that's not very easy or feasible, but I will say this, I will give a plug to MinnPost. And this was actually, I think at the insistence of Peter some years ago, we always include bill numbers whenever we write about anything. And so that is for that very reason. So to whatever degree possible, you as readers can track what is actually in a bill, and you can read the text and you can find out what's going on with it. So Walker, I wanted to get to you though, just about one of the things you do is keep an eye on how issues that are particularly of interest to greater Minnesota, how those things are shaking out at the legislature. What was your sense from this session about kind of what were big priorities and how those kind of how that stuff kind of shaked out?
Yeah, I would think about this two ways. I mean, one of the ways to think about it is the priorities. You know, most Republican legislators are from Greater Minnesota, so just thinking about like generally broadly what those legislators' priorities are, things like lifting business restrictions for COVID, ending the governor's emergency power and the mask mandate, and the emergency powers haven't been lifted, but a lot of those other restrictions sort of have been lifted at this point by Walz. And I know that there is frustration out there among conservatives that the emergency powers aren't completely gone. So depends on how you look at that. The Republicans, as Peter had mentioned, got no new taxes, the PPP and unemployment insurance, tax breaks, things like that. In terms of other policy issues, I mean, there's also there's a lot of stuff that just sort of remains undecided, as we've also mentioned on policy. I wrote a couple weeks ago about, maybe it's just a week ago, time flies. There are new restrictions on manure spreading at really large feedlots, which is an environmental and agricultural issue that has really fired Republicans up, and that isn't resolved. Somebody did just comment, and I don't see the whole comment, but about broadband. That is specifically one thing lawmakers did agree to. They agreed to $70 million in funding, which is quite a lot and likely enabled by the federal stimulus plan. I know that there's a state task force that sets out sort of spending goals for how the state can meet its universal sort of policy objectives. And they had set out, they wanted $120 million over the 2-year operating budget. That was sort of so the state could meet a lower set of speed and distribution goals by, I think it's 2022. So basically now. But I also know that Governor Walz initially proposed about $50 million, and there was some concern about like how much money could really go to that. There's also always concern about how much money in broadband can actually be spent in any given year, just functionally, you know, construction and projects and all that stuff. So $70 million is a, you know, to some it's a lot, to some it's a little less than they would have liked to see. So that's a little bit split. I know there are lots of issues that are favored by groups like the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. You know, they always advocate for more childcare help, water infrastructure, affordable housing, things like that. A lot of that stuff is tied up in the bonding bill. There is about $100 million, I think exactly $100 million for housing infrastructure. And those types of bonds don't need the 3/5 vote. They can be approved by a majority vote. It's a particular type of bond. So those will move forward. But things like water infrastructure and childcare sort of have yet to be negotiated and decided upon. But there is tons of childcare money in the federal stimulus plan. So that is likely to be something that will come out of this session. So there's a lot of different things that you can take with Greater Minnesota. But I would say broadband certainly is a huge issue, and that has some money going towards it. A lot of the other stuff is just sort of unresolved at this point.
Let's talk about one of Peter's favorite subjects, emergency powers. Well, first, let me just pause for a second here. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question on their own? You guys have been great about putting stuff in the chat. There's some great questions in there. But did anybody want to speak up for themselves?
And to do that, you can hit the little reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then click raise hand, and we'll know that you are wanting to speak. You can do that at any time.
Yeah, Tanner, you can just pipe up if somebody can interrupt us if that happens. But Peter, just want to touch base again on emergency power stuff. There's some people I know asking questions about it, but just trying to remember even, you know, Walz extended. The latest state of emergency not that long ago. It seems like it's going to come up, I guess, in early June again. What's kind of the latest thinking on how long is he going to keep doing this and what the consequences are going to be?
Yeah, we thought that the emergency powers issue would be perpetual throughout the session. About the middle of each month is when he extends by 30 days. That starts back when he created the first one on April 13th or 14th. And by law, he's supposed to have the session convened. Obviously, when they were in regular session, they could be here, they could have reacted, they could have rescinded at any time. And there were multiple votes in the Senate to rescind emergency powers. We were thinking early on that it would be difficult for Speaker Hortman to hold the line against rescinding, because if you added up all the votes of people in the House this year who at one time or another had voted to rescind the governor's powers, meaning all the Republicans and enough Democrats to go over a majority, she would lose that vote. There are Rangers who were voting against the governor's emergency powers. Some other people from Greater Minnesota were voting against it. And the thinking was that she's going to have a hard time. She has a pretty small majority just to begin with. What she somewhat skillfully did was she made sure they were always procedural votes. And regular people don't know the difference. I don't know the difference. I know that when the Republicans moved to pull that rescission resolution to the floor when it first came over from the Senate, that was really an up or down vote on the governor's emergency powers. But they can say, no, this was just a vote to follow our regular process, which when a resolution comes over, it gets sent to rules, it gets sent to a standing committee, that committee considers it and decides whether to bring it back on the floor. So this was just a procedural vote to go through our regular process. The Republicans are trying to suspend the rules. We're not going to let them do that. And she held that vote every single time. She held her folks together on a procedural vote every single time. Every now and then somebody would not vote, which was very odd because you can vote from your kitchen. You didn't have to be on the floor, obviously, this entire year, but she held that. And toward the end, as things started to settle down on the pandemic, this became more the concept of emergency powers versus the actual actions that the governor was taking. You know, there's no mask mandate anymore. There's no limits on restaurants anymore. If there's no limits on business anymore, then it became more of an abstraction and became less of an issue in session. The speaker and the majority leader and the governor say they are, in fact, still talking about some reforms to the emergency powers law that could still come, but it's just the temperature under that one was taken down quite a bit as the impacts of the emergency orders took place. And the governor thinks he needs to keep emergency powers for certain things. You get federal money based on whether you are a state that has a declaration of emergency. Texas and Florida and Oklahoma and a lot of Republican states are still under states of emergency for those purposes. Or if you're in Florida or Texas, you use your emergency powers to tell local governments they can't have mask mandates. That authority by the governor of Texas is granted to him by the emergency powers laws in his state. So we think the governor will keep those powers in place for some time. And we will see the legislature in town in the middle of every month maybe for the whole year.
I think we've got a real live question. So we're going to hand it off to Julie Rasmussen. She's got a question.
Thanks. I am curious about, and I think we tried to get at this question earlier, but during the normal session, you can watch video of their committee conference sessions. So during this special session, or until they're all formally back at the Capitol, will we be able to observe those committee meetings similar to the way we did prior to the session ending?
Do you mean observe, say, on your computer, or observe in the room?
On my computer, because everything had been video.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the conference committees so far were, and I think what you might mean is they're in an informal status right now. The conference committees don't exist anymore because they adjourned the session. They have become work groups and become informal, but we were promised that if they have a meeting that's a meeting, as opposed to the two chairs sitting in an office somewhere, that those meetings would be carried on the same video feeds that we've been using. But I also think they might start being live as well. And hopefully they will do both. They have really increased. It used to be that some committees were on audio or video. There was one room in the House that has never been available either way. And I'm like, why are you having meetings down there? This basement room that doesn't have audio or video feeds. They have fixed that a lot. In fact, every single committee and committee room can have some audio or video, primarily video feeds. And again, what we've been told is that they will continue to do an audio or video feed of all of these meetings if they meet. But we're also moving into the point where a lot of that stuff just goes into, again, the two committee chairs and their staff in a thing that's not a public setting.
So all the good work is being done now when we don't actually get to observe it. Okay, thanks.
Walker, I think you can speak to this question, which was somebody put in the chat a while ago, but I think it's something you can talk about Tomassoni and Bach, and just about them. The question is whether their little caucus there is a permanent thing, or is it transitional?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I don't know the answer to that, whether it's permanent or transitional. I would guess that they wouldn't, if I called and asked, they wouldn't say, oh, as soon as, if Democrats took power, I'm jumping ship back to there to try and get my committee post. But I will say that I think that Bach and Tomassoni, as they stated when they became independents, their goal is to retain sort of as much power and influence as they can. And so I think, however they can sort of facilitate that, and if it's sort of setting up a similar sort of situation with Democrats, I could see that happening. Especially since they aren't technically part of the Republican caucus, like I think that they're not going to want to be, in the political minority. And so, I can't see the future on that one, but I do know that however it can shake out, so Senator Bach and Tomassoni can get a, committee chairmanships and things like that. And Senator Bach has been, getting ready to try and do a bonding bill, which, he's a retired carpenter, if I remember, and that's sort of his passion area or one of his passion areas. So I would see that going into the future.
Yeah, do you want to talk just a little bit about bonding? You've written about it, and you obviously wrote about Bach's kind of role and his key role in that. But where did that kind of leave off with the session?
So when I wrote about it, the House had this really enormous bonding plan. I'd have to go back and look at the exact number, but if I remember, it was upwards of $1 billion, or roughly around $1 billion. It had a whole lot of stuff in it, money for redevelopment in Minneapolis and St. Paul that was damaged in riots after the murder of George Floyd. Among other things, there was, other sort of equity provisions, stuff like that. There was things to kind of address climate change, a lot of stuff in there. Senator Bach, and by the way, the House had like dozens of hearings, I think more than 20. And Senator Bach had, at that point, a couple weeks before the end of session, had held like one hearing, sort of playing the cards close to the vest. And his vision for a bonding bill was something smaller, or not even necessarily, I'm sure smaller, but sort of focused on not individual projects in people's districts, but sort of really, as he called, like unsexy things like, asset preservation, maintaining, the state's higher education buildings and things like that. And so that's sort of been his preference, but they were also just basically waiting to see how the federal money could be used, in what way on bonding. And I would say it says in there you're not allowed to use it for debt like bonding, but also Peter's story, he could chime in on, there are some sort of workarounds to pretty much everything, it seems like, in the federal stimulus plan. And so, we're basically in limbo on bonding on that issue as of now. And also, like we mentioned earlier, Kurt Dowd, the minority leader in the House, said he hasn't had any conversations about this. And so basically where we stand is minority parties who, haven't talked about this, and a House and a Senate that are, leagues apart at this point on what they want to see in a bonding bill.
Question from the chat for either of you. Since a big portion of funds committed to education targets is one-time federal money that will go away, is it possible MMB will be required to include inflation in their future education budgeting as a compromise?
No, I don't think so. That inflation is this sort of ongoing issue here about whether or not, if you're doing what's it take for me to do this year's spending next year? They do not factor in inflation for most of the budget, though MMB does do an inflation factor as a secondary number when they do the both the budgets and the forecasts, what inflation would be. That sort of was the underlying issue of this session, was the Democrats said, we don't think we need tax increases this budget because we have all this one-time money. We kind of stopped talking about the $1.6 billion projected surplus for next biennium. That's state dollars only, because the federal dollars almost overwhelmed that. But that is still there. There's also a $2.33 billion rainy day fund that will not only be untapped, but will be restored to its previous level with some of this money. And the Democrats basically said, yeah, we're just going to use one-time money and worry about ongoing spending later, because they were not going to get this tax increase that they said they wanted for future biennia to provide a sustainable source of funding for this new spending. So we're going year to year. And I guess if I'm a school teacher with a layoff notice in my hand, and I had a choice between getting laid off or being rehired for the next 2 years and have to worry about it in 2 years, I'd probably take the latter. And the thing about this federal money is they are leaving $1.233 billion of what they're getting from the feds. They're leaving that up unspent. Technically, the state doesn't get it until next year, but they're not trying to spend it this budget. They'll come in and try to spend it and maybe spend it in 22. And this federal money can be spent for 4 years. So unlike the CARES Act, which had this sort of odd deadline that all the money that the state got had to be spent by December 31 of 2020, there's no hard deadline like that. So you might decide to dole out some of that $1.22 billion from the ARPA funds to sustain some of these programs into subsequent biennia. But other parts of the spending are, I mean, the summer school money obviously is one-time money for a one-time cost. That's about $75 million. That's eventually will be doled out if in fact, well, the state will get it, but it hasn't gotten it yet. And it hasn't technically been appropriated to the districts because the legislature didn't pass that yet, but the promise was made. So some of it is in fact one-time spending. But inflation, no.
Another question from the chat. Is there any
Hey,
discussion?
Andy, can
Yeah.
we, Suzanne J has a question to ask
Like
live.
a real question.
Oh, they're all real questions. Suzanne, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Tanner, and they are all real questions. This may be moot because, especially as Peter just explained about the one-time money, but way back when this all started, the governor announced that he was taking a 10% pay cut, I think, and extended it to cabinet members. The Republicans have been very strong in trying to avoid tax increases, and they wanted to slash state agency budgets by 5%. Has anybody besides the governor and some of his cabinet members felt any financial sacrifice during the pandemic?
I'm not even sure if that that pay cut has been maintained. There were no substantial layoffs in state government throughout the COVID pandemic, primarily because the state never faced the deficits that they thought they were going to face. We went from last May projecting a $4 billion deficit for this biennium to a $1.6 billion surplus for this biennium, partly because, and understandably, the economists just did not know how to forecast this recession. It's like nothing they'd ever seen before. So they were very pessimistic in May, and then they realized that tax collections really didn't fall off as though they thought they would. So there were no need for cuts, layoffs or anything like that. I think the Republican 5% budgets were, again, part of this theater that they wanted to have a low number to go into these discussions with the governor and the speaker, to start from a lower number than everybody else did. Most of the committee chairs in the Republican committees didn't like that number that they were having to build budgets around. They would sometimes publicly say, I don't like this budget, but this is our target, so we've got to do a budget like this, knowing very well that that budget would never become law. So frankly, no, I don't. The state government moved a lot of people around. So you might be working in one agency and be lent off to another agency, Department of Health, some contact tracing people. So some folks moved around, but I don't know of any substantial layoffs in in government. I mean, remember there was even talk of closing some of these small prisons up north, which caused a lot of concern, but those prisons were never actually closed.
A lot of people in Minnesota did take severe financial hits. So maybe it's just symbolic, but I think it makes people feel a little better when everything is shared. But thanks for your explanation.
Peter Walker, we've also gotten a couple questions about appointing a new U of M regent. There's a regent who recently died. Who gets to fill that position, or do we know how that's going to proceed?
If there's authority for governors to appoint temporarily, it's not been used since I've lived here, and there have been regents who have resigned before their term was over. They've all gone back to legislative appointment process, and the positions have been left vacant. That's what's happened at least while I've been here. I don't know that there's any gubernatorial appointing authority for any of the regents in the higher ed system. That all comes back to legislative appointment.
We also had a question, Peter, actually several want to know about redistricting, and you have written quite a bit about this. So do you want to just speak to where that is at and what we can expect moving forward before 2022?
Well, Peter Watson was on the call. We should just turn it over to Peter and let him explain it, because I'm just going to quote from him. The state did get the statewide numbers quite late, later than would be normal. They still do not have block level data, which is what's needed to zero down into legislative and congressional districts. That's now expected sometime in August. So it has prevented the legislature from going through the motions of trying to reach bipartisan agreement on legislative districts and congressional districts, because there's nothing they can do until at least August. It compresses the time period quite a bit, but I'm not sure anyone who's being honest believes that the legislature with a DFL House and a Republican Senate can come up with an agreement as to how to draw legislative districts that will determine which of them gets reelected. And I mean, you get into these situations where I might put two senators in the same district because it just, it's sort of how the numbers work. And the growth is in the metro area, and districts are going to have to move around. And there's no way that the House and the Senate are going to agree to a map that has Senator Limmer and Senator Osmek in the same Senate district. I mean, the Ds would love that. They would get a kick out of that. That would be fun for them. The Rs would not love that so much. So it'll go to the courts. I mean, the courts are already gearing up because they have litigation pending before them. They have accepted jurisdiction. They will presumably appoint judges to be on a panel. They will hire some staff, map-making staff. As Peter Watson points out, the software is so sophisticated now that it doesn't take a mainframe computer to process the data that you'll get from the census and draw equal districts that also meet other court considerations. So I would expect there'll be lots of maps tossed around, but probably sometime very early next year, the court will determine that the legislature has in fact failed. They will move ahead with maps that were drawn and supervised by a panel of judges, and they will order it sometime early enough to let people run for office next year. The state law deadline is, I think, February 15th of 2022 for those lines to be drawn. And then since he's here, I would suggest we invite Peter in to just see how much of that I screwed up. And Tanner, can he unmute himself? Yeah, Peter, just unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, this is the other Peter Watson. I think Peter Callaghan did an excellent job of explaining the basics of what's going on and what's likely to happen. He didn't get into whether there will be massive changes in party control as a result of redistricting. And that will depend on who draws the maps, but I think it's probably going to be the court that draws the maps pursuant to a lawsuit on which I am the lead plaintiff. And that, as he said, it'll happen. We will see the court's maps on February 15th of 2022. But how much change will there be? When a legislature draws a map, it has great freedom to make big changes in how the districts look. But when a court does the map, it doesn't have that freedom. It's supposed to draw a least changes plan. So in Minnesota, that means that probably the districts, both for Congress and for the legislature, will remain relatively closely divided. There will be enough competitive districts so that depending on the political winds, depending on the strength of the candidates and the strength of their campaigns, either party could control either house of the legislature in the course of the next 10 years. So in a way, it's just same old, same old. Minnesota is going to be a closely divided state, likely, and our elections will be quite interesting. And I'd be happy to answer any other questions that anybody might have. Oh, I just think one thing about the maps. The legislature has not yet geared up itself to draw maps. They chose not to have anybody trained until at least June. But I went ahead and drew maps. I know how to draw maps and created a database. And that's what I've used to create 2 sets now of maps of Congress, the Senate, and the House. But any of you on this call could go right now to your computer and go to Dave's Redistricting online or to Districtor online and draw your own maps of Minnesota districts, however you want them to look. Those maps that you might draw are probably not going to be the same maps as the court draws because you might want to be more creative than the court can be. But if you want to have fun, just go to either Districtor or Dave's Redistricting, and there are some others out there. And have at it. Have a great time.
And we've put the website there in the chat. So thank you, Peter, for helping us out on this. Since we're a news organization, we do believe in deadlines. So we are going to have to wrap this up for today. So thank you, Peter Callaghan and Walker Orenstein and Peter Watson for his guest starring appearance. Tanner, was there anything else you wanted to let people know before we sign off for the day?
I'll just reiterate our gratitude to Great River Energy and Darla Cashin at RBC Wealth Management for their support for this event, and also my plug for newsletters, minpost.com/newsletters, and for your support, minpost.com/support. And thanks to those of us who already support and read us, and thanks to Walker and Peter and Andy for your insights today. And thank you all for joining us. I think that does it. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.